So thank you so much. Can I respond? Is that fine? Can I respond? Yeah. Right. No, thank you so much, Mashrur, for that very, important and valuable intervention. I mean, very important. And I think you've really hit the point about, I mean, and this is something that he does talk about, which is that, the idea of linguistic feudalism, which already places languages in a hierarchy. And you're absolutely right, which is that it's only African literatures which are translated into English, which we access, and that too. I mean, there's also always a selection of what kind of and across different grids, across that we make a selection of what are the authors that we're going to access and read so certainly, I mean, there's certainly a point, and I'm so glad that you did speak about Algeria, and you did speak about Morocco and other and that's why, I mean, I think what one needs to really think about is that how far we are from what Ngugi was imagining as the idea of world literature, because even when we talk about African literatures, you're absolutely right in pointing out the fact that that we don't really look at Arabic as part of African literature, or so many other kinds of registers of African literatures which may not be within nations, not even bounded within nations, in so many languages which might have no national geographies in themselves. So there's of course many issues there, but more than that, I mean, even when we talk about things like world literature, how far we are from the idea of world literature, where I mean, for instance, I mean, I often ask my students, I mean, who are greatly interested in post-colonialism, that how far we are from decolonizing our own pedagogical understanding of literature and culture, that you don't even know who's the most important writer, let's say from Fiji or from Mauritius or from, whichever, one can talk about 100 countries like that. And so how far we are from the project of a truly, truly non-imperial idea of world literature, which would be truly, and I'm so glad that you also made a distinction between post-colonialism and decoloniality, because I think I would also be someone who would not be very comfortable with the idea of post-colonialism, and probably align with the idea of decoloniality, because I think if we really need to decolonize our understanding even of post-colonialism in some senses, we have a huge project ahead of us which we need to really undertake, not just in terms of making languages and literatures and cultures accessible through English, but also not just through other, colonially powerful languages of French, Portuguese, Danish, Spanish, etc., but languages in themselves, which may not necessarily have an encounter with colonialism, and so those non-imperial languages and literatures and cultures which have been articulated in their own locations in some senses, and we certainly don't have access to that. And if we have to really talk about Globalectics as a vision which is really multi-log in that sense, then we have to access so many quarters which we absolutely have no access to currently. So you're absolutely right, and I think we need to really think about our curricular engagements, anew in terms of what we do in the name of post-colonialism and decolonization, and whether that's really even touching the tip of the iceberg in some senses. So I think we are really short on that, and I'm so glad that you did talk about this. And so certainly that's of course very important. So to respond to the first part which you spoke about, which is the idea, and again translation. I mean, when he speaks about translation, he's not just talking about the idea of translation again feeding into a hierarchy. I mean, the idea is not that from less powerful languages you translate into more powerful languages, but there has to be the idea of what many years back, which is not very fashionable, but what Meenakshi Mukherjee has talked about as diagonal translation, not just vertical translation, horizontal translation, but also diagonal translation. So translation into languages, we don't have to get mediated through the languages of English or other languages. So if translation really has to become an ally, then it has to become a solid ally in making languages and literatures and cultures available to us, which is outside the fold of what we consider as erstwhile languages of colonialism in some senses. So I think the point that you made about world literature and how far we are from the vision of what world literature truly, if it has to embrace the idea of world literature as Ngugi imagines it to be, then I think we really are short of that. And there's really a lot of work which needs to go into our own curricular engagements and our practices in themselves. That's certainly something that one needs to, that we need to do. But the point that you made about a multi-log is, of course, again, an important one, because I mean, already we've seen that there's been a renaming of most departments. And again, the kind of researches which happen in the departments has certainly veered away from only dealing with printed text to look at, oral articulations, performance text, and of course, digital text, etc., etc. So certainly we're not bounded within the narrow idea of only print cultures. There's, of course, all kinds of registers that one needs to look at. And therefore, there has been a renaming of most departments as not just departments of English literature, but also, or cultures of English languages or speaking cultures of languages, etc., but also of departments of literature and culture. So, and culture probably allows for that kind of a expansive space for us to be able to accommodate all other registers of art, which is what Ngugi was talking about when he was talking about a multi-log in some senses. So I'm not very sure whether I respond to that or not, but to your questions or not. But I think you're absolutely right, which is that we need to, and we already in probably the researches that we do and our own individual researches, and also collectively, if we look at the kind of research output of departments of literatures, very few would probably be only dealing with what might be considered literature in a pure sense. In that sense, I mean, not only in terms of our methods, we're informed by so many other registers of sociology, politics, ethics, philosophy, art, etc., but even as an ontology or ontological engagements have changed from not just looking at literary text, but also looking at memes and all kinds of video games or music or whatever, etc., So certainly we have willy-nilly, whether we call ourselves that or not, certainly veered away from literature as as some sort of a standalone discipline to embrace the idea of culture studies. So certainly, I mean, I would tend to agree with that, and embrace the idea of a multi-log in that sense. So, yeah.
Thank you. That's awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so there are some questions in the chat box. Should I just respond to those? Yeah, so I think Little Chakravarti Mithun has asked us that could you briefly say in what ways global and world literatures are different? Yeah, so I think the reason why Ngugi does not really, I mean, of course, as you can make out, he's suspicious of the received idea of globalization and globalism itself, and that's why his response is globalectics in some senses. But of course, as he imagines his globalectics to be, his imagination of globalectics is very strongly grounded in the idea of non-imperialist heart of literature, which is the idea, and that's why he locates it within the post-colony, and the post-colony itself is the whole world. So his imagination is a different kind of an imagination from the received idea of globalization, because we know globalization, and of course globalization is deeply problematic in so many ways, and that's why he veers away from the idea of globalization to embrace the idea of world literature. But even there, his imagination of world literature, as one has undertaken the discussion here, is quite differently premised as compared to, let's say, it draws upon people like Goethe and Marx and Engels, but it moves away from the idea of nations to be able to free the idea of world literature and open itself out to many possibilities in some senses. And that is why probably he embraces the idea of world literature as opposed to the idea of global literature, because obviously global still has the idea of a certain clique, a certain idea of a certain select, powerful, literatures and cultures which find representation and others do not. In some senses. Rifat asked that could you please shed light on the origin of the word globalectics? Of course, as I said, the globalectic, I don't know if one can attribute the coinage to Ngugi, but certainly he does talk about this interesting portmanteau term of global and dialectics. And like I said, that he's not really interested in dialectics only as a method in some senses, but of course he's talking about a globalectical vision, which is what his vision is all about. So I'm not very sure whether he's the first one to coin it. I mean, one will have to do a bit of research to see if there's a usage of that word before him or not, but certainly as a full-fledged work which posits it as a method, as a vision, as an imagination, as a certain political, ethical, imperative, and a certain kind of a literary category. He's certainly someone who explores it a great deal in this particular work of his. And then there is,
I think there is no more question in the chat box. Sure. If anyone else have any question, you can just raise your hand and directly ask the question to our speaker. So is there any other question? I think there is another question from Rifat Ahmed Riyad.
Yeah, as I understand, Globalectics helps different cultures to come together. So does it also blur the notion of individuality? I think Ngugi is not someone who's really, I mean, so is as, I mean, Mashrur was also saying, which is that, and if you remember that quote that I quoted, where he says that, that howsoever nationally conscious a literature might be, and it might emerge from certain locations and certain regions and certain nations. And of course, I mean, all literatures will be located in some space or some temporal marker or the other. And he's not talking about any of that being a problem in that sense. Of course, each text will have its own marks of individuality or belonging to a particular location or belonging to a particular space, etc., etc. But it's not to, so he's not really talking about the blurring the idea of individuality in itself. All literatures will emerge from some nations or some quarters or some regions or some communities or some spaces or the other. But what he's certainly alerting us to is the idea of nation, and especially, I mean, especially in our current times, where nation has been used as a political tool in some senses to legitimize, to delegitimize who's a migrant, who's a refugee, who's a citizen, and who's not a citizen. I mean, it's of course a very charged term in our times in some senses. He's asking us to step outside the prison house of nations and nationalisms and these insularisms and these parochialism, which kind of tie us down to the idea of insularities and cocoons us and gives us a certain false sense of superiority or comfort or, you know, the idea of tradition or civilization, etc., which legitimizes certain kinds of, you know, affective engagements with literatures for us, you know, and validates certain things. And so he's warning us against that in some senses. So when he's talking about world literature being truly representative of all nations, as Mashrur also said, the Congress of Nations and all nations. I mean, he's not talking about blurring of individualities, but for all individuals to finally find a space in some senses within that particular idea of world literature, not the world literature being inhabited only by a select few. That is what I think he is really driving towards.
Thank you. I got it. So in that sense, could we say that he is also postmodern? Because in postmodern theory, we find that the people of the marginal people has also the voice. So we would say that he is also very postmodern in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, you know, honestly, I mean, I like to shy away from using tags because, you know, I mean, I don't know how helpful it is for us to think that, oh, if we call him postmodern, somehow it'll be better or something like that. I mean, but the spirit of what you said, which is that, you know, talking about the margin, certainly, I mean, obviously he's interested in the question of those who've been elided from the discourse of what constitutes world literature. So certainly he's interested in them finding a certain kind of a space and representation. So, yeah, so on that point, you're absolutely right. But I'm not very sure whether I'm really interested in classifying him as postmodern or post-colonial or not. But yeah, so yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I think there are some questions.
Yeah. So there's a question by Lytton that how's poor theory connected with globalectics? I think how poor theory is connected to globalectics is primarily in terms of how he imagines poor theory to be creative, experimental, embodied, experiential, etc. And of course, against a certain received tradition, to be able to, you know, to be able to make a distinction between what he says, density of words and density of thought. So he's very critical of a certain baggage of certain jargonized theory that we've received. And as opposed to that, he's talking about a certain simplicity of communication through which one should be able to communicate the idea of world literature or globalectical vision that he primarily has in mind. So his idea of globalectics is precisely to be able to question the received tradition of outlooks, of theories, of ways of approaching text, etc., etc. If we have to ultimately dislodge and unlodge the text from these received traditions, which kind of already, you know, straitjacket these texts into certain ways of reading, certain ways of understanding, certain ways of experiencing, etc. And so therefore, he's saying that if you have to have a globalectical vision which should be able to make a paradigm shift for us, then we have to be critical of that received tradition, whatever that received tradition might be, whether it's theory or outlooks or experiences, etc., or ways of reading or our methods. And so in that sense, poor theory is connected to his whole idea and informs his whole idea of globalectical vision in some senses. And then There is a question that says that, can you please make a comment on how does Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Globalectics concept resonate with language rights and the preservation of indigenous languages? Yeah, I mean, he may not have used the term indigenous languages, but I think his globalectical vision is certainly linked to the idea of language rights, because when he talks about translation as the language of languages, he's obviously not just, and since he talks about, the whole idea of globalectics is something which is hinged on the idea of post-colony, where the post-colony is to be located all across the world, and all across the world means all literatures and all languages in some senses. He's certainly, though not, underscoring and underlining the idea of indigenous languages, but he's certainly making a case for all languages and translation from all languages becoming part of world literature. And of course, it's a vast, he said that sometimes we can get probably daunted and we can fall back and withdraw into our own little cocoon realities and worlds in some senses, because that's easy for us to do. And that's why the task of globalectics is so huge. It's such a huge task before us if we have to really embrace the idea of world literature, which is non-imperial, which is decolonial in its orientation, and which really embraces his ethics and politics of, and which would therefore make space for all kinds of language rights and all kinds of indigenous languages and literatures and cultures and oral cultures also finding a space, rather than us subscribing to the received notions of whether it's aesthetic feudalism or whether it's linguistic feudalism, and to be able to sidestep that and to make a case for all kinds of languages having their own rights to exist and flourish in some senses. So yeah. So, I don't know if I've responded to all the questions or not, and I don't know if I've adequately responded to the questions or not, but yeah.
I think you have responded to all the questions. Is there any other question? Or,
may I have a question, please?
Yes, sure.
Thank you, Dr. Simi Malhotra, for your wonderful presentations. I was wondering about the role of artificial intelligence today. I was thinking about that the artificial intelligence is going to be one of the major challenges to Ngugi's imagination, to Ngugi's thinking, because when today the machines are taking the role of human beings, and machines are going to be the challenges to human creativity. I was listening to a debate on BBC the other day, and one of the conclusions of the debate was that the artificial intelligence is going to be the major challenges for humans' creativity, human thinking, even also for literature. I don't know what's your opinion about the artificial intelligence. I don't know, you know about ChatGPT. ChatGPT is writing poetry. You know very well, perhaps. I don't know, in future, maybe machines are going to write literature, from novel to play to poetry to even stories. I don't know, what do you think about artificial intelligence and the globalectics?
Yeah. No, that's a very important question. And obviously, when all of us, even in our own universities and departments are engaging with the question of ChatGPT and, how do we change our modes of evaluation and what do we do, et cetera, et cetera. So certainly, I mean, it's an urgent need in some senses, but, I don't know how Ngugi would have responded to ChatGPT. I mean, because obviously, this is a book which is, before ChatGPT was on the horizon in some senses, but you see, I mean, this is what I would say, Porin, which is that certainly, I mean, it is being talked about as a huge challenge for whatever has been there before that, et cetera, et cetera. But you see, I mean, this is precisely what would have happened. Let's say, for example, when one would have when print would have come, or when we would have moved from silk, writing on scrolls and silks and bark to printing, et cetera, or from printing to something. So whenever there's a new technology, and it's not the technology is the idea of techne, is a fairly old concept in some senses. And so technology, of course, always challenges, our modes of organization or modes of thinking, of writing, of literature, of culture, et cetera, et cetera. And so ChatGPT is another register, artificial intelligence is another register which has certainly come, but just as, I mean, when one talks about that, and which is not to say that that the world of technology is not mired in its own kind of political problems. I mean, of course, we are fairly aware of algorithms and, and data mining and, what it does, et cetera, and all that. I mean, whether it's Facebook or, Zuckerberg or whatever. I mean, you can talk about the hack or Cambridge Analytica or whatever. I mean, persuaders and all kinds of things which are certainly happening. But at the same point of time, I think, I mean, it's a world which is out there. I mean, one can't deny its existence. And so therefore one has to, just as, let's say, for example, one would have been suspicious of the novel form or suspicious of this or suspicious of that, etc., etc. That's our initial reaction. And then one, of course, also finds interesting ways of creative outputs and creative engagements and ways of mediating and negotiating with such, such things which emerge on the horizon. And that has historically always happened. Civilizationally, it has always happened, whether it's print culture, whether it's, electronic culture, whether it's electrical, mechanical ways of, the culture industry or whatever, etc., etc. So of course, there are always responses which emerge from civilizationally from human societies, to whatever encounters one may have with whichever kind of technology which may have emerged at any point of time. And so therefore, I'm not, I'm not really an alarmist in that sense, who would get alarmed by ChatGPT, that's another register. And, there are very interesting things which are happening, in the world of games, in the world of memes or art, or, even with big data analysis with literary scholars I engage with, people like Lev Manovich, et cetera, and all that. I mean, so there are interesting possibilities and interesting works which can come out of that. So I'm not, so while we must certainly, I mean, which is not to be a romanticist really in that sense, while we must certainly be aware of, all the implications, let's say, of artificial intelligence and how we will negotiate with those kind of challenges which face us. I would not be an alarmist and therefore, start thinking, start thinking, or getting too worried in some senses. I mean, one could also think about probably possibilities of great collaborations with the artificial intelligence in producing all kinds of registers of poetry, like you were saying that it's writing poetry now. So, I mean, it's, registers of poetry. So I don't think one needs to be necessarily an alarmist, because I'm sure every such historical moment would have produced its alarmist and produced interesting works which would have come out of that particular moment of, or that eventual moment of, emergence of some particular technology. So that would be my response. I don't know what.
So, let's be optimistic.
Not necessarily optimistic. We should be cautious, but at the same point of time, I mean, which is not to say, you see, I mean, of course, there's no denying the fact that there is a certain kind of a capitalist, militarist logic to the whole idea of cyberspace, etc., etc. But can we enjoin any kind of enabling discourse to that? How is it that we make this particular discourse responsive to our own, political, ethical, moral, emotive, affective, whatever kind of ends that we may have in mind? So I think there are interesting ways of negotiating these spaces. That's what I would say, while being cautious, while being alert to all the problems. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Is there any other question? Okay. I think there is no more question, but thank you so much once again to our speaker, Professor Dr. Simi Malhotra, for this amazing question and answer session. I would like to thank our discussant of today's session, Mashrur Shahid Hossain, for his insightful discussion, and also our audience for this engaging with the question and answer session with such spontaneity. Now, I would like to request Foreign Chandra Barman, the convener of Distinguished Lecture Series 8, to deliver his vote of thanks for today's session.
Oh my God, thank you, Nusrat Madam. I think you have already done it. Anyway, a very good evening to all of you. First of all, on behalf of the department and on behalf of TESOL Society of Bangladesh, I express our sincere gratitude and heartfelt thanks to our honorable resource person, the speaker of today's session, Professor Dr. Simi Malhotra, Head of English Department of a Central University, New Delhi, India, and our honorable discussant, Professor Mashrur Hossain from English Department of Jahangirnagar University, for your wonderful, insightful, enlightening, and one participant mentioned outstanding deliberations, presentations, and contributions. We are grateful for sharing your valuable time, your precious time, and particularly for your great cooperation. I also express our heartfelt thanks to all participants. It's been a very fascinating and engaging session. We are grateful to Professor Dr. Saidur Rahman, our advisor and the president of TESOL Society of Bangladesh, for his vision and guidance. We are grateful to our head madam, Tawhida Yasmin, for her constant support. We know she has been very sick and she's on leave, but she has joined today. Please allow me to thank the whole team, because it is the team members who have put everything to make it possible. A big thank you goes to Nusrat Madam, the anchor of today's session. She has been very active, very helpful and supportive. A special thank you goes to Sharmin Sultana Rima and Masum Bhai, our executive of the department, for their support. I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for TESOL volunteers for their help. I must thank all my colleagues for their constant support. Please let me remind you, this is not the end. Distinguished lecture series will continue, and we are hoping to see you very soon. Have a good night, and thank you. Over to you, Mr. Madam.
Thank you so much, Foreign Chandra Borman. So before we end today's session, I would like to ask all the participants to turn on their cameras so we can capture this moment.